Welcome to a journey into the unknown, where workdays turn into nightmares and the woods conceal terrifying secrets. In this video, we dive into stories about strange encounters at work, eerie creatures lurking in the shadows, and unsettling ghostly apparitions. From ghostly movie theater customers to sinister happenings in the deep woods, each story will keep you on edge. Stick around to discover what hides behind these haunting tales, and don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Let's get started and see if you can make it through until the end. What lurks in the cabin's attic? Leonardo had always enjoyed the solitude when he worked. Being a painter was his passion, and that cabin in the Washington mountains was the perfect place to spend a month creating without distractions. Isolated, surrounded by tall pine trees and the calmness of the mountains, the cabin offered the peace he needed. It was his second week there, and his work was progressing well. The silence was only broken by the soft sound of his brushstrokes, until one night, he began to hear noises coming from the attic. At first, Leonardo thought it was just the wind or a small animal, something common in the area. But the frequency of the sounds increased over the following days, as if something large was moving around upstairs. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his work, but the unease only grew. It became impossible to concentrate. One night, while applying varnish to one of his paintings, he heard a louder noise, like something heavy dragging across the attic floor. Deciding to investigate, he grabbed a flashlight and climbed the wooden stairs. As he opened the attic door, the noise stopped. The air was colder up there, different from the rest of the cabin. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail: the attic hatch in the ceiling was slightly open. Suddenly, the hatch trembled as if something was pushing against it. Leonardo froze in place. He took a deep breath but couldn't shake the chill running down his spine. Cautiously, he approached, and just as he was about to shut the hatch, a large, hairy hand reached down, trying to pull it open further. It was enormous, covered in thick, black fur, and clearly not the hand of any ordinary animal. Terrified, he stumbled backward, his heart racing. This was no simple creature in the attic, that much was clear. He quickly descended the stairs, locking the door behind him. He tried to calm down, but his mind couldn't stop racing. Was he imagining things? Could the varnish fumes have caused him to hallucinate? That night, Leonardo didn't sleep. The image of that huge, hairy hand haunted him. He thought about leaving the next morning, but something stopped him. He needed to know what was happening up there. What was in the attic? Had it all been a vision caused by the varnish fumes, or was something truly terrifying lurking in the shadows? Determined to find out, he started making a plan. He gathered his tools and prepared a stronger mixture of varnish, thinking that if it was some kind of creature, the fumes would drive it away. The next morning, he climbed back up to the attic. This time, everything was silent, but the hatch was still ajar. He knew something was waiting for him up there, but he couldn't turn back now. Leonardo stood at the foot of the attic stairs, clutching the canister of varnish in one hand and a cloth mask in the other. He had no real plan beyond getting a better look at whatever had tried to open the hatch the night before. But deep down, he felt that if he could get close enough without being seen, the fumes from the varnish might help disorient whatever was up there. His mind raced, bouncing between doubt and fear. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe there wasn't anything up there at all. But that hand, the thick black fur, it was too vivid to dismiss. He slowly ascended the creaky wooden steps, each sound causing his heart to race faster. The air felt heavier as he neared the attic door. He reached out, opening it just a crack. Everything was silent. No movement. No strange sounds. Just the eerie quiet of an abandoned space. He pulled the door open wider and stepped inside. The attic was dimly lit by a small window on the far side. Boxes and old furniture were stacked around the room, covered in thick layers of dust. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But then, as Leonardo's eyes adjusted, he noticed something unusual in the corner of the attic. Paw prints, large and deep, ran across the dusty floor, leading to the open hatch. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the paw prints disappearing into the shadows. Whatever had made them was still in the attic. He tightened his grip on the varnish canister, his fingers trembling. Slowly, he made his way toward the hatch, trying to keep his footsteps as quiet as possible. Suddenly, he heard it, the soft sound of something moving above him. Leonardo froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The hatch began to tremble again, the same way it had the night before. Then, without warning, a hairy paw appeared, followed by another. The creature was climbing down. From his vantage point, Leonardo could only see its hands, but they were huge, muscular, and covered in thick fur. Leonardo panicked. He fumbled with the varnish canister, twisting off the cap as quickly as he could. The creature's head began to emerge, and he saw it clearly for the first time, wolf-like, with gleaming eyes and sharp, pointed ears. The creature was descending, and behind it, another one appeared, slightly smaller but equally terrifying. Without thinking, Leonardo lifted the canister and sprayed the varnish toward the creature's face. The fumes hit it directly, and it recoiled, letting out a low, guttural growl. The second creature hesitated, watching its companion stumble back. Leonardo used the moment to make his escape. He bolted for the stairs, sprinting down, his legs barely keeping up with his speed. He locked the attic door behind him, breathing heavily, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The creatures didn't follow him, but the damage was done. He knew they were still there. And they wouldn't stay hidden forever. Leonardo stumbled into the kitchen, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He glanced around, realizing how vulnerable he was in the cabin. There was no phone signal, and the nearest town was miles away. He cursed himself for agreeing to work in such a remote place, but there was no turning back now. He had to figure out what those creatures were and how to get rid of them. The thought of going back into the attic made his skin crawl, but he knew he couldn't leave without confronting the situation. With his heart pounding, he grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and decided to check the damage in the attic. Maybe, just maybe, the varnish had driven them away. Or perhaps they had retreated deeper into the attic, waiting for the right moment to strike. He climbed the stairs again, slower this time, his senses heightened with every creak of the floorboards. The attic door stood closed, just as he had left it. Leonardo hesitated for a moment, gripping the flashlight tightly. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The attic was dark and silent. He shined the flashlight around the room, half expecting to see the creatures lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The paw prints were still visible on the floor, leading back to the hatch. But the hatch itself was closed. Had they gone back inside? Cautiously, he stepped inside, scanning every corner with the flashlight. As he moved deeper into the room, his eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. Near the far wall, next to a stack of old crates, was a small nest. It was crude, made of shredded paper, bits of fabric, and twigs. And in the center of the nest were several small, wriggling figures, puppies. Leonardo's breath caught in his throat. They were wolf-like, with patches of dark fur and tiny, sharp teeth. They whimpered and squirmed in the nest, completely unaware of his presence. His mind raced. The creatures upstairs weren't just wild animals, they were protecting their young. The varnish fumes hadn't just driven them away, it had likely made them retreat to protect their litter. Suddenly, the hatch trembled again, and this time it wasn't just a paw that appeared. The creature's face slowly emerged from the opening, its gleaming eyes locking onto Leonardo. It let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the attic, filled with rage and warning. Leonardo didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned on his heel and sprinted for the stairs. Behind him, the growling grew louder, and he could hear the attic door slamming open. They were coming. This time, they wouldn't let him escape so easily. Leonardo raced down the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps as he flew towards the front door. Behind him, the growling and thudding of the creatures grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the cabin. He could almost feel their hot breath on the back of his neck, pushing him to move faster. His heart pounded in his chest, and panic took over. He wasn't thinking anymore, he was just running, desperate to get out of the cabin before the creatures caught up to him. The moment he reached the front door, Leonardo yanked it open and stumbled outside. The cold night air hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop. He sprinted across the front yard, heading toward the safety of the trees on the far side of the property. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare see how close the creatures were. The only thing that mattered was getting away. Behind him, the creatures burst through the door, their guttural snarls echoing across the yard. Leonardo's lungs burned, but he kept going. The forest was his only chance. If he could lose them in the trees, maybe he'd have a chance of surviving. As he neared the tree line, Leonardo risked a glance over his shoulder. His stomach dropped. The creatures were terrifyingly fast, their massive bodies moving with an unnatural speed. Their glowing eyes were locked onto him, and they were gaining on him. Without thinking, Leonardo veered left, cutting through the underbrush. He zigzagged between trees, trying to confuse the creatures. The branches whipped against his face and arms, but he barely felt them. He heard the creatures crashing through the forest behind him, their growls growing louder with each step. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. His legs were already starting to give out, and his breaths came in ragged gasps. He needed a plan, and fast. His eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help. That's when he saw it, a large, fallen tree with a hollowed-out section underneath. It wasn't much, but it was his only hope. Leonardo dove beneath the fallen tree, pressing himself into the narrow space. He tried to steady his breathing, but his heart was hammering in his chest. He lay completely still, praying the creatures would pass him by. The growling grew louder as the creatures approached. Leonardo could see their massive shadows moving between the trees, their glowing eyes scanning the forest floor. His pulse quickened. They were too close. One of the creatures stopped just a few feet from the tree. It sniffed the air, its massive claws digging into the dirt. Leonardo bit down on his lip, trying to keep from making any sound. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. After what felt like an eternity, the creature let out a low growl and moved on. Leonardo stayed still, too afraid to move. It wasn't over. It might never be over. Clawed terror on the open highway. The Nevada desert stretched for miles, the horizon blurring into the shimmering heat of the mid-afternoon sun. Two brothers, Jake and Sam, were on their regular cross-country route, hauling goods from Reno to Las Vegas. The truck hummed steadily along the empty highway, a familiar sound that usually blended into the background of their long drives. The landscape was vast, isolated, and seemingly devoid of life, just sand and distant mountain ranges. As the hours passed, they approached a rundown rest stop, a small clearing off the road marked by a weathered sign and a pair of dilapidated structures that served as a bathroom and a shelter from the sun. The stop was desolate, forgotten by time and travelers alike. Despite the eerie stillness of the place, the brothers decided to pull in for a short break. The truck came to a halt, the engine ticking as it cooled in the desert heat. Stepping out of the cab, the brothers were met with an unnatural silence. No wind stirred, no distant sound of animals or insects broke the quiet. The air was thick with an odd tension, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. There was something unsettling about the atmosphere, though neither of them could pinpoint what it was. As the truck sat idling in the heat, a sudden noise cut through the silence, sharp, metallic, like claws scraping against metal. The sound came from the side of the truck, faint at first, but unmistakable in the stillness of the desert. Both brothers paused, instinctively glancing towards the source of the noise, their hearts quickening. The scratching continued, more deliberate now, as if something was deliberately trying to get their attention. The truck, a solid and dependable machine, now felt like a fragile barrier between them and whatever was outside. Without any clear view of what was causing the sound, a cold sense of unease crept over them. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty lot, the brothers knew they needed to leave. The air had shifted, becoming heavier with the promise of something unknown. Without delay, they got back into the truck and restarted the engine, the growl of the motor cutting through the eerie silence. As the truck rumbled back onto the road, dust kicking up behind it, the landscape seemed to close in. The sense of isolation deepened as the vehicle gained speed. It wasn't long before Jake, at the wheel, caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror, movement at the edge of the road. A large, dark shape moving swiftly, too fast to be anything normal. It was only when the creature came fully into view that the reality of what they were seeing hit them. A massive, coyote-like figure, larger than any wild animal they had ever encountered, was running alongside the truck, keeping pace with it effortlessly. Its form shifted between 4 legs and 2, something unnatural in its movement. The creature's eyes gleamed in the fading light, fixed intently on the truck. The brothers drove faster, but the creature didn't fall behind. Instead, it seemed to gain speed, as if playing some sinister game of pursuit. The truck barreled down the highway, the vast desert stretching endlessly in every direction, but the sense of escape grew more distant with every mile. The creature continued to pace the truck, its limbs moving with an unsettling, fluid grace that defied the laws of nature. Jake gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. His brother Sam sat frozen in the passenger seat, his eyes wide, darting from the creature to the road ahead. As the truck accelerated, the landscape outside became a blur, but the creature never wavered. It darted closer to the side of the truck, its dark fur bristling as it moved. The brothers' minds raced, trying to comprehend what they were witnessing. The creature's form was unmistakably canine, but its sheer size and the way it shifted between running on 2 legs and 4 was beyond anything they had ever encountered. It was as though the thing belonged to some forgotten nightmare, lurking in the shadows of the desert. Suddenly, the creature veered towards the truck, brushing against the side with a loud thud. The entire vehicle shook, the force of the impact sending a shudder through its frame. Jake fought to keep control of the wheel as the truck swerved slightly, tires skidding on the asphalt. "Stay on the road," Sam finally shouted, breaking the silence that had gripped him. His voice was shaky, filled with the same fear coursing through both of them. The creature wasn't just chasing them anymore, it was attacking. With another sudden burst of speed, it leaped onto the truck, its claws scratching against the metal as it latched onto the back. The brothers could hear the heavy thud as the creature's weight landed on the cargo bed, followed by the sound of claws raking against the roof. Inside the cab, every sound was amplified, the scrape of claws, the thump of the creature's limbs as it moved across the truck. It felt as though the air inside had become suffocatingly thick, charged with a palpable sense of dread. The brothers exchanged a single glance, both knowing that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, the engine roaring in response as the truck lurched forward. The vehicle surged down the highway, but the creature clung on, its claws gouging deep marks into the roof. They could hear it now, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire truck. Sam, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, saw the creature's glowing eyes peering over the edge of the truck's roof. Its teeth bared in a grotesque snarl, too close, too real. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as the truck barreled down the road, the speedometer climbing higher, but no matter how fast they went, the creature remained. The brothers' fear morphed into pure adrenaline as they fought to outpace the thing that had attached itself to their truck. The creature was relentless, its claws now tearing at the engine hood, pulling at the metal as if it were trying to rip its way through. Each time it struck, the truck shuddered violently, and it felt like only a matter of time before it managed to tear something important free. Suddenly, with a loud screech of metal, the creature slipped. There was a violent lurch as it lost its grip and fell off the side of the truck, disappearing into the cloud of dust kicked up behind them. Jake didn't slow down. He pushed the truck harder, as if putting as much distance between them and whatever that thing was could erase the terror they had just lived through. But even as the truck sped away, the image of the creature's eyes, glowing in the rearview mirror, was burned into their minds. They had shaken it off, but neither brother dared to believe it was truly gone. The night pressed on, and the truck roared down the empty highway, the brothers still gripped by the chilling encounter with the creature. Every creak of the truck, every shadow cast by the dim headlights seemed to hold a lingering threat. The desert around them, once a vast, open space, now felt constricting and hostile. The road ahead stretched out, seemingly endless, but the landscape was changing. rocky formations jutted out of the earth like jagged teeth, and the highway began to wind through the foothills. The brothers' muscles ached from the tension, their bodies on edge, expecting the creature to return at any moment. The memory of its claws on the roof, the weight of its form on the truck, haunted them with every passing mile. Then, without warning, the engine began to sputter. A sickening cough emanated from under the hood, and the truck jerked slightly, the power fading in and out. Jake's heart raced as he glanced at the dashboard, where the engine warning light blinked ominously. They were in the middle of nowhere, with no sign of civilization in sight. The truck slowed, the engine struggling, until it finally gave out completely. It rolled to a stop on the side of the road, surrounded by the desolate, moonlit landscape. Jake cursed under his breath, knowing they had no choice but to get out and investigate. The air outside was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the cab, and the stillness of the desert seemed even more unnerving now that the truck had gone silent. Jake popped the hood and stepped out, the flashlight in his hand casting an eerie glow on the truck's damaged front end. Deep scratches marred the paint, and the metal was bent in places where the creature had gripped it. He ran the beam of the flashlight across the engine, searching for the source of the problem. Steam hissed from a punctured hose, and it was clear that something had torn through the engine's components during the attack. Sam joined him, standing close by, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The sense of being watched returned, stronger now in the silence. The desert stretched out in every direction, but it felt as though something was lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlights, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jake worked quickly, trying to patch the hose as best he could with what little tools they had. The brothers were tense, their ears straining for any sound that might indicate the creature's return. The air felt thick with an unseen presence, and every gust of wind rustling through the rocks seemed like a whisper of danger. Then, in the distance, a sound broke the stillness, a faint, low growl. It wasn't close, but it was unmistakable. The brothers exchanged a glance, their faces pale. They knew it was the creature. It had followed them. It was hunting them. The sound grew louder, echoing off the rocks. The brothers moved quickly, throwing the tools back into the truck and slamming the hood shut. Panic surged through their veins as the growling shifted into a rumbling, almost guttural roar, the kind that sends chills straight to the bone. They couldn't see the creature, but they could feel it, its presence closing in, moving through the darkness like a shadow of death. Jake jumped back into the driver's seat, frantically turning the ignition. The engine sputtered and groaned but refused to start. The creature's growl was louder now, a menacing reminder of the danger that was creeping toward them, unseen but undeniably near. Sam gripped the dashboard, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, waiting for those glowing eyes to appear again. Just as the growl seemed to envelop them, the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, Jake floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward with a violent jerk. They sped off down the highway, leaving the growl behind, but the threat still clung to them like a shadow they couldn't escape. The truck surged down the dark highway, the engine groaning from the strain, but Jake kept his foot firmly on the gas. The brothers' hearts pounded in their chests, the fear of the creature still coursing through them. They didn't dare look back, afraid of what they might see chasing them through the night. As they sped away, the barren desert stretched endlessly on either side, offering no sign of civilization. The narrow road wound through rocky terrain, and the headlights cast long, jagged shadows against the stone outcroppings. Every twist and turn of the road felt like it might reveal the creature once more, lurking just out of sight, ready to strike again. But as the miles passed, the growls and roars faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the truck's rumbling engine and the wind whipping through the cracked windows. Still, the brothers couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was following them just beyond the reach of their vision. Suddenly, without warning, a sharp thud rattled the truck. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was unmistakable. Jake and Sam exchanged a terrified glance. The truck's tires skidded slightly on the asphalt as Jake fought to keep control. The sound had come from above, a heavy thump on the roof. The creature was back. Fear spiked through them as they realized it must have jumped onto the truck from one of the rock formations. The roof groaned under the weight, and they could hear the faint scraping of claws against the metal, like nails on a chalkboard. Sam's breath quickened as he glanced at the roof, half expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes peering down through the windshield. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He knew they couldn't stop, not now. The creature was relentless, and they were miles from the nearest town. He pressed the gas pedal harder, the truck speeding up, hoping the acceleration would force the creature off. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. The roof buckled slightly under the weight, and the brothers could feel the truck swaying with each movement the creature made. It was trying to break through. Sam scrambled for anything he could use to defend them, his hands shaking as he grabbed the tire iron from under the seat. Then, with a final lurch, the truck hit a bump in the road, and there was a deafening crash. The creature had lost its grip, and the sound of its heavy body hitting the ground echoed through the night. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror just in time to see the massive form tumble down the road behind them before disappearing into the darkness. The truck roared on, but the brothers' nerves were shattered. They didn't dare slow down, not until the first signs of civilization came into view. Hours passed before they finally reached a small truck stop, the lights glowing dimly against the early morning sky. They pulled in, the truck sputtering as it finally came to a stop in the parking lot. Exhausted and trembling, the brothers got out of the truck, their legs shaky beneath them. The truck was battered, deep claw marks etched into the metal, the roof dented where the creature had tried to break through. But there was no sign of the creature itself, no more growling or scratching. It was over, at least for now. They stepped inside the truck stop, the warm glow of the fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the terror they had just experienced. Sam leaned against the counter, still gripping the tire iron tightly, while Jake spoke to the clerk, asking about the nearest mechanic. As they waited for help, the brothers couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The creature they had encountered wasn't just an animal, it was something else, something not of this world. And though they had left it behind in the desert, they knew they would never forget the night they were hunted. Even as they drove away from the truck stop later that morning, the image of those glowing eyes and the sound of claws scraping against metal stayed with them, a haunting reminder of the creature that had stalked them through the night. And as they crossed the state line, they couldn't help but wonder, was it still out there, waiting, watching, and perhaps ready to strike again? Terrifying shadows in an empty store. Jack had spent countless nights working at the large retail store. The night shifts were quieter, with the store almost always deserted. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, artificial glow across the empty aisles. Something about the stillness of these shifts always felt unsettling, though he tried to ignore it. The store was filled with the faint sounds of distant humming from the air conditioning system, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of boxes or the distant clang of metal as shelves settled. That night, however, the usual discomfort escalated. As Jack moved through the electronics section, taking inventory, an uneasy tension settled over him. He glanced around, suddenly aware of every shadow that crept between the aisles. Without warning, an object fell. A television, perched securely on the shelf just moments before, crashed to the ground, shattering the stillness with a loud crash that echoed across the store. Jack flinched, heart racing. He stared at the broken screen, pieces of glass scattered across the floor, as he tried to make sense of how it had fallen. The shelf had seemed sturdy. Glancing down the aisle, Jack caught a glimpse of something, movement, just at the edge of his vision. His eyes snapped toward the end of the row, but nothing was there. The aisle was empty, and the shadows seemed to stretch and distort in the dim light. He stood still for a moment, listening for any sign of life beyond his own labored breathing, but the store had fallen back into silence. An inexplicable chill ran down his spine. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. He shook his head, forcing himself to move on, as he continued his duties, stepping carefully over the broken TV. But no matter how much he tried to focus, the air felt heavy with an invisible presence. As he passed between the aisles, more items seemed to shift slightly out of place, books on display leaning at odd angles, boxes moved from their original positions. The atmosphere had changed. What was once the simple stillness of an empty store now felt charged with tension, as if the air itself was alive, pulsing with an unseen energy. The feeling lingered, and as Jack moved deeper into the store, the creeping sensation of being followed grew stronger. Something, or someone, was moving just out of sight, always one step behind him. Every corner he turned, every aisle he passed, felt as if it was hiding something. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he continued through the store, completing his tasks, yet haunted by the creeping dread that seemed to follow him through every section. By the end of his shift, the unease had settled deep into his bones. He hurried through the closing procedures, unable to shake the growing sense that the store was more than just empty. The silence no longer felt like the absence of sound, it felt like the presence of something unseen, watching, waiting. The next night, Jack returned to work, still unsettled from the previous shift. The memory of the fallen TV lingered in his mind, though he had convinced himself it was just a freak accident. The eerie sensation of being watched, however, had been harder to dismiss. He clocked in and began his duties, walking through the quiet aisles once more. About an hour into his shift, Jack spotted his coworker, Chris, in the electronics section. It was a relief to see someone else. The presence of another human being, even if distant, made the space feel less oppressive. Chris was busy with some boxes, seemingly stacking them on one of the lower shelves. Jack nodded in his direction, though Chris didn't respond. Strange, but not entirely unusual. Jack continued his rounds, stocking shelves in the grocery section. The store's eerie quietness still hung in the air, but knowing Chris was nearby helped keep his nerves in check. That is, until he made his way toward the back room about 30 minutes later. When Jack entered the back room, he froze. Chris was there. He was laughing and talking with another coworker, Judy, as they sorted through inventory. Jack felt his stomach drop. He had just seen Chris in the electronics section not too long ago, hadn't he? "How did you get here so fast?" Jack asked, his voice edged with confusion. Chris looked up, frowning. "I've been back here the whole time, man," Chris replied, raising an eyebrow. Judy nodded in agreement, adding that they'd been together for over an hour. Jack's skin prickled. The store wasn't big enough for someone to have moved that quickly, especially without passing him. Jack's mind raced. If Chris had been in the back room the entire time, then who, or what, had he seen in electronics? His hands felt clammy as the realization sank in. The figure he had seen wasn't Chris at all. It had moved just like him, wore the same uniform, and had the same posture, but something had been off, though Jack couldn't quite put his finger on it at the time. The back room suddenly felt too small, the air thick with a sense of growing dread. Jack didn't say another word, but his mind was spinning. Was it a trick of the light? His imagination running wild? Or was there something else in the store, something that could mimic the appearance of others? He didn't want to sound crazy, but the more he thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. The weird sounds, the objects shifting on their own, and now this doppelganger. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had been playing with him, leading him down some path of confusion and fear. That night, as he clocked out, the familiar sensation of being watched returned. But this time, it was different, more intense, more palpable. It felt as though the air itself was pressing in on him, wrapping around his mind like a heavy fog. As he left the store, he couldn't help but glance back through the glass doors. In the dimly lit aisles, he thought he saw a shadow, just for a split second, a figure that stood exactly where he had seen Chris earlier. Jack hurried to his car, the weight of the encounter pressing on his mind. Whatever was happening inside the store, it wasn't over. Jack returned to work the following evening, his nerves frayed. The sense of unease had grown stronger, lingering in the back of his mind throughout the day. He had told no one about the doppelganger incident, afraid they would think he was losing it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had seen wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Something was wrong with the store, and the strange occurrences were escalating. As he clocked in, Jack noticed that the store felt colder than usual. The air conditioning wasn't on full blast, but a chill hung in the air. His footsteps echoed down the long, deserted aisles, and every little sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began again. Jack was restocking a shelf in the frozen foods section when he heard a loud crash from the electronics department. His heart raced as he instinctively turned toward the sound, a knot forming in his stomach. The electronics department had become the epicenter of the strange happenings, and Jack dreaded what he might find. Cautiously, he made his way toward the electronics section, the air growing heavier with each step. As he approached, he saw that several boxes had been knocked over, their contents scattered across the floor. But that wasn't what sent a shiver down his spine. It was the TV screens. Every single one of them had turned on, despite being unplugged. Static filled the screens, and a low, crackling sound emanated from the speakers. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he stared at the TVs, transfixed by the flickering images. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the aisle, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and unmoving, watching him from the shadows. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving the figure. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the figure was gone. The TVs blinked off as if nothing had happened. Jack stood frozen in place, his mind racing. He was sure he had seen something, or someone, but now there was no trace of it. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, but the fear gnawing at his insides told him otherwise. Jack hurried to the back room, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the electronics section. When he entered, Chris and Judy were once again busy with their tasks, oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the front of the store. "I think there's something wrong with the store," Jack blurted out, unable to hold back any longer. Chris looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The TVs, the static." "I saw something," Jack stammered, his words coming out in a rush. Judy frowned, exchanging a concerned glance with Chris. "Are you sure you're okay, man? Maybe you just need to take a break," Chris suggested, his voice calm but cautious. Jack shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. He knew what he had seen, he wasn't crazy. But as he stood there, he realized that no one else would believe him. Whatever was happening in the store, it was targeting him, and he was alone in this. That night, as Jack clocked out and left the store, the feeling of being watched returned. It was stronger than ever, a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He hurried to his car, glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure following him. But the parking lot was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. As Jack drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the store wasn't done with him yet. Whatever force was at work, it was getting stronger, and he was its next target. Jack knew he couldn't avoid the store forever, even though the very thought of going back made his skin crawl. The following night, he returned for his shift, forcing himself to push past the growing dread. But something had changed. The atmosphere inside the store felt more oppressive than ever, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The air was thick with tension, and every creak, every distant thud, sent his heart racing. As he made his way through the aisles, Jack noticed small things out of place, items shifted on shelves, lights flickering in strange patterns, and the same eerie coldness that had been present the night before. He was on edge, constantly glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the electronics department again. His duties for the evening took him back to the frozen foods section, but he couldn't focus. His mind was racing, and his eyes kept darting toward the front of the store, where the electronics section loomed in the distance. He felt it, the pull, the undeniable draw of that area, as if something was beckoning him closer. Jack tried to resist, but his curiosity won out. He left the frozen section and made his way to electronics. As he approached, the feeling of being watched intensified. The aisle was empty, but the sense of another presence was palpable. He stepped into the section, his breath catching in his throat. The TVs were on again, this time, all of them. But instead of static, they were showing distorted images of the store itself, as if filmed from a strange, disjointed angle. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized the images were live. They were showing him, standing in the electronics section, watching the TVs. But it wasn't just him. the shadowy figure was there, too, standing just behind him on the screen. Jack whirled around, but there was nothing. The aisle was empty, but his heart pounded as if it were about to burst out of his chest. His mind raced, panic setting in. He was seeing things, right? This couldn't be real. But then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the aisle, slow, deliberate, and far too close. Jack turned back to the TVs, and the figure was moving. It was walking toward him on the screen, each step synchronized with the sound of footsteps in the real world. He couldn't move. His legs were frozen in place, his mind reeling as the figure drew closer. And then, in one horrifying moment, it stepped out of the screen. Jack screamed, stumbling backward as the shadowy form loomed in front of him. Its features were indistinguishable, its body a dark, shifting mass of shadows and static. But its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, as if it were draining the very life out of the air around it. Without thinking, Jack turned and ran. His feet pounded against the tile floor as he sprinted toward the back room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps followed him, growing louder and faster with each passing second. He burst into the back room, slamming the door behind him. Chris and Judy were there, startled by his sudden entrance, but Jack didn't care. He couldn't explain what had just happened, he could barely process it himself. All he knew was that he had to get out, now. "I'm done," Jack gasped, his voice shaking. "I'm not coming back." Chris and Judy exchanged concerned glances, but they didn't argue. Something in Jack's eyes, the raw terror etched on his face, told them that whatever he had experienced, it was real to him. Jack left the store that night, vowing never to return. As he drove away, the feeling of being watched finally began to fade, but it never fully disappeared. The shadows that haunted the electronics section had followed him, leaving him with the unsettling knowledge that the store wasn't just a building. It was alive, and it had chosen him as its prey. And though Jack never set foot in the store again, the memories of that final encounter would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because in the depths of that cold, empty store, something had been watching. And it still was. Theater ghost haunts late-night shifts. The theater had always been old, its charm drawing in film enthusiasts from all around the town. But with its age came the stories, whispered among the staff, about Maurice, a ghost said to have died during a screening many years ago. Maurice wasn't just any ghost, he was known as the Watcher because, according to legend, he had passed away while watching a film, and his spirit never left. Jenna, a new hire, heard the stories but brushed them off like anyone would. Who believes in ghosts anyway? Yet, something about working the late shift in the quiet, nearly empty theater had a way of making the impossible feel real. The building had an eerie stillness after hours, with the distant hum of projectors the only sound accompanying the footsteps of the cleaning staff. On her third night working the late shift, Jenna was assigned to clean theater number 3. The dim glow from the emergency exit sign barely lit the cavernous room, and the silence pressed in as she moved from row to row, collecting discarded popcorn bags and cups. Everything seemed fine until she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She froze mid-step, every hair on her body standing on end. The room was supposed to be empty. She was the last one left. Swallowing hard, Jenna slowly turned around, her eyes sweeping across the dark rows of seats. Nothing. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, and she shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling. But the sensation only grew stronger, like invisible eyes boring into her back. It felt too real. Determined to finish her shift, Jenna quickened her pace, but her nerves were shot. When she bent down to pick up a cup that had rolled under a seat, she heard it, soft, barely a whisper, a faint, rasping breath. She whipped around, her eyes wide and frantic. The rows were still empty, but the whispering continued, a low, unintelligible murmur. Panic gripped her as she dropped her trash bag and bolted for the exit. Once she burst into the hallway, the sound stopped abruptly. Her heart raced, but the theater was silent again. Jenna stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she imagined it all? But the chill in the air and the prickling sensation on her skin said otherwise. Maurice, the Watcher, was no myth. She knew now that someone, had been in that theater with her. She didn't dare to look back inside as she quickly finished her cleaning duties, her hands trembling as she locked the door to theater number 3. Before leaving, she whispered a shaky promise to herself: she would never work alone in that theater again. After the incident in theater number 3, Jenna kept her distance from that specific screening room. But she couldn't avoid every strange occurrence in the old building. The staff had long shared stories about Oscar, the spirit that haunted the back halls and service areas. Oscar was named after the Sesame Street character, fitting, since he was most active around the trash hall and service elevator, seemingly obsessed with garbage. Jenna had heard the stories, but like before, she didn't take them seriously. That was until one evening when she was tasked with taking out the trash at the end of her shift. The trash hall was dark and narrow, a claustrophobic space lined with dumpsters. It was known to be where Oscar would play his tricks, but Jenna wasn't thinking about that as she pushed the overloaded trash cart toward the back. The squeaky wheels echoed off the walls, and a foul odor clung to the air as she opened the first dumpster. She tossed the bags in one by one, her nose wrinkling at the smell. After closing the lid, she turned back to grab another bag but froze when she saw one of the dumpsters had moved. Jenna blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She had just passed that dumpster, hadn't she? And now it was at least 5 feet closer. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. With a nervous chuckle, she shook her head and tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to her tired eyes playing tricks on her. But then she heard it, a low metallic scrape, like a lid shifting against the metal frame. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. She turned to see the lid of the dumpster wobble slightly, as if something inside was trying to get out. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced with possibilities. Was it a raccoon? A rat? Suddenly, the lid flew open with a bang, and the trash inside erupted out like it had been thrown. Jenna jumped back, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The bags had burst, spilling garbage across the hall. Her first instinct was to bolt, but her feet were rooted to the ground. Then came the sound she had dreaded most, a low, growling voice from deep inside the dumpster. It was soft, but she could hear it muttering something unintelligible. Oscar. Panicking, she abandoned the cart and sprinted for the elevator. The doors creaked open just in time, and she hit the button to close them. As the elevator began its slow descent, she could still hear faint whispers coming from the hallway, like the voice was following her down. The elevator stopped with a jolt, and she rushed out, leaving the trash haul behind. That was the last time she ever took out the trash alone. The other staff members laughed when she mentioned Oscar, but Jenna was convinced. Whatever haunted that trash haul wasn't just a story. Oscar was real, and he didn't appreciate being disturbed. After Jenna's encounter with Oscar, the trash haul became a place she avoided at all costs. But the theater held another ghost, one that no employee could easily escape: George, the most mischievous of all. George had a reputation for causing chaos with the equipment, disrupting showings, and leaving staff puzzled. Heavy objects would shift or fall, and theater equipment would malfunction, but no one could ever explain why. Jenna was in the projection room one evening, a quiet shift, running the evening's late show. She had been left to manage it on her own while her coworker, Darius, took a break. The movie was playing smoothly, and Jenna allowed herself a moment to relax in the dimly lit room. The hum of the projectors filled the air, a comforting sound for anyone used to working in the theater. But then, as she sat in her chair, something caught her eye. One of the massive cardboard standees, advertising the upcoming action blockbuster, wobbled ever so slightly. It was odd, there wasn't any draft or air conditioning strong enough to cause it to move. Jenna narrowed her eyes, watching it carefully. The standee jerked again, this time with more force, like someone had pushed it. She stood, heart beginning to race, but before she could approach, the entire cardboard figure toppled over with a loud crash, sending a spray of papers and dust into the air. Jenna gasped, backing up instinctively, her eyes darting around the empty room. There was no one there. No one had touched it. Suddenly, the projector flickered, cutting out for a brief second before roaring back to life. The film's reel skipped, making the image on the screen below jolt violently, causing the audience to groan in confusion. Jenna rushed over to the control panel, frantically adjusting the settings, but nothing seemed to fix the glitch. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Not from the screen, but from the reflection in the glass of the projection room window. A shadow, darker than the dim lighting, stood behind her, tall and looming. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. She didn't dare turn around. The lights in the projection room flickered, the electrical hum growing louder. Papers on the desk began to shift as if an invisible hand was brushing them aside. Then, with a sudden thud, the door to the back room slammed shut. Jenna jumped, finally spinning around to face the shadow, but it was gone. The room was empty, save for the fallen standee and the eerie silence that followed. Jenna's hands trembled as she grabbed the radio, calling for Darius. Her voice cracked as she stammered out a weak explanation of what had happened, but Darius was unfazed. "Oh, that's just George," he said casually. "He likes to mess with people, especially when you're alone." Jenna didn't laugh. She was starting to understand why everyone had their own story about George. Weeks passed, and Jenna became more accustomed to the strange occurrences at the theater. She had learned to avoid certain areas during her shifts and to keep her head down when working alone. But one night, something happened that would stay with her for the rest of her time at the theater. It was a quiet night, much like the evening she had encountered George in the projection room. Jenna was assigned a close-up after the final show, a task she usually didn't mind. She had gotten into a routine, double-checking the auditoriums, locking the doors, and making sure everything was in order. Most nights passed without incident. As she made her way down the long, empty hallway leading to the exit, she felt a familiar chill. The hallway was dimly lit, and the sound of her footsteps echoed off the walls. The cleaning crew had already left, and Jenna was completely alone in the building. She quickened her pace, eager to finish up and leave, but something stopped her in her tracks. A loud bang echoed from the auditorium to her right. It sounded as though something heavy had hit the floor. Jenna's heart raced. She stood frozen, staring at the door of the auditorium. There was no reason anyone should be inside. The last show had ended hours ago, and all the patrons had long since left. Against her better judgment, she approached the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The auditorium was completely dark, save for the emergency lights casting an eerie red glow on the seats. Her eyes scanned the rows, but everything seemed to be in place. Then she noticed it, a figure standing in the middle of the aisle, its back turned to her. Tall and dark, the shape was unmistakable. It was George. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It simply stood there, as if waiting. Jenna's throat went dry. She knew she should leave, but something compelled her to stay. Slowly, the figure began to walk, its heavy footsteps echoing through the empty theater. It moved up the aisle, toward the back exit, where Jenna stood frozen in place. She didn't dare move as the figure drew closer, the air growing colder with every step. When the figure was only a few feet away, it stopped. For a moment, Jenna thought it might turn toward her, but it didn't. Instead, it walked through the back exit doors without a sound, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Jenna stood there for what felt like hours, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were glued to the floor. It wasn't until the lights in the hallway flickered that she finally snapped out of her trance. Without looking back, she bolted out of the building, locking the doors behind her. As she drove away from the theater that night, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that George had let her see him one last time, just to remind her that she was never truly alone in the theater. Alone in the woods, the cabin horror. George, a seasoned carpenter, had taken on what he thought would be a simple job, repairing an old cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The place was remote, surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles, offering nothing but the sounds of wildlife and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was perfect for someone like him who enjoyed working in isolation. The cabin itself was a rustic structure, weathered by time, with creaky floorboards and a roof that had seen better days. The wood smelled of age and moisture, a scent George had come to associate with his line of work. The cabin's owner, an elderly man from the nearby town of Asheville, had asked George to stay in the cabin while he worked on it. He thought nothing of it at first, figuring it would save him the commute through the rugged terrain every day. But there was something about the place that felt off. The first night, as George lay in bed, he noticed an unusual stillness in the air. The typical sounds of the forest were missing, no chirping crickets or distant owls. The only noise was the occasional creak of the cabin, as if it were settling into the earth. His tools, meticulously laid out on the workbench earlier, seemed to have shifted positions overnight. George shrugged it off as forgetfulness, convincing himself that he must have moved them without realizing it. The next morning, the sun filtered weakly through the canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the yard. George began his repairs, focusing on the roof, but his mind wandered back to the eerie silence of the previous night. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the cabin, even though he had been working there all day without a soul in sight. As he hammered nails into the roof, George heard a faint knocking sound, almost like a light tap, coming from within the walls. He paused, listening carefully, but the noise stopped as soon as he did. Brushing it off as a trick of his tired mind, he continued working. But as the day wore on, the strange occurrences escalated. His hammer, which he had left on the windowsill, had disappeared. He found it later on the porch, though he was sure he hadn't gone outside yet. That night, the strange noises returned, louder this time. It wasn't just the creaking of the cabin anymore. It was a rhythmic thudding, coming from somewhere within the structure. George, trying to rationalize it, thought it might be an animal trapped in the walls. Armed with a flashlight, he searched the small attic and basement but found nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. As the darkness of the night pressed against the windows, George lay awake, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him from the shadows. Something was wrong with this cabin, something far beyond old wood and rusty nails. The following day, George tried to shake off the unease from the previous night. He threw himself into the repairs, focusing on the cabin's foundation, hoping the hard work would keep his mind off the strange occurrences. The morning was quiet, save for the occasional crack of his hammer against the old wooden beams. But as the hours passed, that eerie feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. By mid-afternoon, as George was preparing to install a new window, something odd happened. He spotted movement in his peripheral vision, just a quick blur by the edge of the trees. Instinctively, he turned his head, scanning the forest, but there was nothing there. Only the still, shadowy outline of the woods. He told himself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. After all, they were deep in the Appalachian wilderness, and wildlife was common. But something about the movement had been unnatural, too fast and too deliberate for a deer or even a wolf. Trying to brush it off, George went back to work. But the strange feeling lingered, like a low hum of tension in the air. As he installed the window, the rhythmic knocking sound he had heard the day before began again, this time louder and more persistent. It came from the walls, but it seemed to move, as if whatever was making the noise was walking along the inside of the cabin's structure. George froze, his hands still holding the window frame. He listened closely, his breath shallow, but the knocking continued, this time traveling from one side of the room to the other. It sounded almost like someone, or something, was inside the walls. The rational part of his mind told him it was probably a raccoon or some other small creature nesting in the walls. But the sound was too heavy, too deliberate, to be a small animal. Feeling a cold sweat on the back of his neck, George grabbed a crowbar and began prying away a few boards from the wall, determined to figure out what was causing the sound. As the old wooden planks creaked and gave way, the knocking stopped suddenly. George paused, his heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was only silence. He shined his flashlight into the gap in the wall, half expecting to find a nest or some critter staring back at him. But the space was empty. No animals, no sign of life. Just darkness and dust. He ran his hand along the inside of the wall, feeling the rough wood, searching for any clue. But there was nothing. No holes, no loose boards, no explanation. George sealed the wall back up, but the unease had settled deep in his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was making the noise was still there, watching him, waiting. That night, the knocking returned once more, louder and more insistent, echoing through the walls like a heartbeat. This time, it felt less like an animal and more like something trying to communicate. George lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, afraid to close his eyes. The rhythmic thuds seemed to pulse through the entire cabin, as if the structure itself was alive, breathing in sync with the mysterious force within its walls. The next morning, George awoke to a heavy fog hanging over the cabin. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, was eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the air thick and still. George felt the weight of the previous night pressing on him, the strange knocking still fresh in his mind. He decided to distract himself with work again, this time focusing on the roof repairs. But as he climbed the ladder, a strange sensation washed over him, a cold, prickling feeling, as if he were being watched from the woods. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the blur of movement from the day before, but there was nothing. Just the dense fog, obscuring the forest in a ghostly white mist. As George worked, the silence became oppressive. Each hammer strike felt louder than it should, echoing off the trees like a signal, calling out into the wilderness. He worked quickly, eager to finish before the fog thickened, but the feeling of being watched never left him. It clung to him, gnawing at the back of his mind. Suddenly, a loud thud came from inside the cabin. George froze on the ladder, his heart skipping a beat. The noise sounded like something heavy had fallen, or been thrown, against the wall. He climbed down, hurrying inside to investigate. The moment he stepped into the cabin, the air felt different, thicker, almost suffocating. He checked each room, but everything seemed in place. Nothing had fallen, and there were no signs of disturbance. Yet, the atmosphere felt wrong. There was a tension in the air, like a storm was about to break. And then, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just a gentle tapping. It was frantic, like fists pounding against the walls, coming from all sides at once. George stood frozen in the center of the room, his breath shallow as the sound surrounded him, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. He grabbed the crowbar again, his hands shaking as he rushed to the wall where the knocking was loudest. He pried away the boards, his heart racing, half expecting something to burst through. But as the planks came loose, the sound stopped, and once again, there was nothing inside the wall. No animals, no broken beams, nothing to explain the relentless pounding. George backed away, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was he losing his mind? Had the isolation finally gotten to him? But as he stood there, staring at the gaping hole in the wall, a low growl echoed from behind him. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The growl had come from the back of the cabin, near the small storage room he had yet to repair. Slowly, cautiously, he moved toward the sound. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silent cabin, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the door, the growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the walls like an animal caught in a trap. With trembling hands, George pushed the door open, expecting to find an animal, a bear, maybe, or a wild dog. But what he saw was far worse. George stood frozen at the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Inside the small, dim storage room, something moved in the shadows. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a pile of old tools or boxes shifting in the dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw it clearly. Crouched in the corner, almost blending into the darkness, was a large, hunched figure. Its shape was unnatural, vaguely human but twisted, its long limbs curled unnaturally around its body. The creature turned its head slowly toward George, revealing glowing, animal-like eyes that locked onto him. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and beast, with a wide, gaping mouth that stretched too far across its face, filled with jagged teeth. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat, filling the small room with an unbearable tension. George took a step back, his legs trembling as fear surged through him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The creature shifted slightly, rising onto its haunches, and in the dim light, George could see its long, clawed hands gripping the floorboards. He tried to move, to retreat, but his body refused to cooperate. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the cabin itself was pressing in on him. The creature took a slow, deliberate step forward, its claws scraping against the wooden floor. Each movement was measured, predatory, like a hunter toying with its prey. In that moment, George knew he had to escape. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't something he could fight off with a crowbar. He forced himself to move, turning on his heel and bolting for the front door. The moment he moved, the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, a sound so unnatural and horrifying that it seemed to reverberate through his entire body. George sprinted through the cabin, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Behind him, he could hear the creature's heavy footsteps, thudding against the floor as it gave chase. The cabin's walls seemed to close in around him, the narrow hallway stretching endlessly as he raced toward the door. He could feel the creature's presence looming behind him, its breath hot on the back of his neck. He reached the door and fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The creature's growl grew louder, closer, until it was right behind him. George threw open the door and stumbled outside, gasping for air as he slammed it shut behind him. He didn't stop running. He sprinted through the clearing, his legs burning as he raced toward his truck. Behind him, the cabin stood ominously in the fog, the creature's shrieks echoing through the trees. George didn't look back. He reached his truck, yanked open the door, and jumped inside. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. He peeled out of the clearing, dirt and rocks kicking up behind him as he sped away from the cabin. As the fog swallowed the cabin behind him, George's mind raced. He didn't know what he had seen or how to explain it. All he knew was that something was lurking in that cabin, something unnatural, and it had almost caught him. The further he drove, the more the tension began to fade, but the memory of those glowing eyes and that monstrous growl would haunt him forever. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the creature chasing after him. But all he saw was the dense fog, swallowing the road behind him. George kept driving, vowing never to return to the cabin again.